The old woman hadn't spoken a word in over an hour, but the way she cradled the coffee cup in her cracked hand said everything. Something about her silence made Henry stop wiping tables and just watch her like she was made of 1,000 untold stories. He didn't serve free meals often. His little corner diner in upstate New York barely made enough to keep the lights on. But when she shuffled in that night, soaked to the bone with trembling lips and no coat, something inside him cracked wide open. "Ma'am," he'd said gently, unsure of her name or if she'd even answer. "The chili's hot and the coffee's fresh. On the house tonight." She'd looked up at him with clouded eyes, her gaze not quite meeting his, and nodded once. That was it. No thanks. No smile. Just that nod. Now, as he watched her nibble at the buttered toast like it might disappear, Henry wondered what chain of heartbreaks had brought her to his booth. His diner, Henry's table, had stood for 23 years, a stubborn old place with peeling booths, a jukebox that hadn't played since '08, and a bell above the door that still rang like a church bell when opened. Locals came for meatloaf, coffee, and pie. Strangers came and went. But this woman felt different. He poured her another cup of coffee without asking. "Cream?" he asked. She shook her head. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Black's fine. Always been fine." The bell above the door jingled, and Henry turned instinctively to welcome whoever entered, but the booth stayed on his mind. That booth in the far left corner by the window. The booth where the old woman sat not like a customer, but like a ghost unsure if she belonged in the land of the living. When the door closed again, he stepped behind the counter, pulled out a pen and the same pad he'd used for years, and scribbled a note. "Old woman. Left booth, ask if she needs shelter tonight." She stayed until closing. He sat across from her when the last patron left, and the grill hissed its final sigh. She hadn't eaten much, just half a bowl of chili and the toast. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked, elbows on the table, fingers laced. She looked at him slowly, the way old trees might look at wind, as if she'd seen 1,000 like him come and go. "I had somewhere once," she said. "A long time ago." Henry nodded. "I got an extra cot in the back. It's warm. Not much, but better than the streets." The woman studied him for a moment that stretched into silence. "You don't know me," she said. "Why would you do that?" Henry leaned back in the seat and exhaled. "Because someone once did the same for me. That's all." She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. She slept in the back storeroom that night, curled under a wool blanket near the old coffee bean sacks. Henry heard her coughing at 3 a.m. and made her some tea. She was asleep again by the time he brought it back. He never got her name. By week's end, she was still there. Every morning, she sat at the same booth and waited for the coffee. She never asked, never assumed, just waited, hands wrapped around the ceramic mug like it gave her a reason to keep breathing. On the 5th day, Henry decided he needed to know more. "So," he said, sliding into the booth with her after the breakfast rush, "what's your story?" The woman smiled faintly, just barely. "You first," she said. That surprised him. He hadn't expected deflection, or maybe it was curiosity. Either way, he leaned back and sighed. "Born and raised in Buffalo," he began. "Dad worked construction. Mom was a nurse. I joined the Navy, served 7 years. Came home, opened this diner. Married once. Divorced 3 years later. No kids. Still don't know what I'm doing half the time. But this place," he gestured around them. "This place keeps me sane." She watched him with a kind of sadness that didn't pity, it understood. "You ever been hungry?" she asked. He nodded. "I have." "Then you know," she said softly. She looked down into her coffee, voice cracking as she continued. "I had a boy. My son. Beautiful child. Blonde hair. He used to call me Mama Bird. Said I sang him to sleep like a lullaby." Her hands shook, and Henry didn't interrupt. "We were living in Albany," she continued. "Then came the layoffs. Then the bills. Then the sickness. Cancer, they said. I couldn't afford the treatment. I lost the house. Then the car. Then everything else. My boy went to live with his aunt. I couldn't keep him with me anymore." The words broke like waves on a broken shoreline. She didn't cry. Her eyes had long dried up, Henry guessed. But her voice carried the weight of oceans. That was 12 years ago. Henry didn't ask for more. Instead, he got up, brought her a fresh slice of warm pie, and left her alone. The story of the old woman, now quietly known as Mama Bird by Henry, and the night cook spread quietly among the regulars. Nobody asked too many questions, but some started leaving extra bills on the table. Others offered coats or blankets. One woman brought in a tin of cookies and simply said, "For her." Then came the letter. It arrived one Tuesday morning, addressed only to Mama Bird, care of Henry's table. Henry handed it to her carefully, unsure if she'd even open it. She stared at the envelope for a long time before sliding a finger beneath the flap. Inside, in neat, careful handwriting, "Dear Mama, I've been looking for you. I never forgot you. I found this diner through a man online who said you were seen there. If you get this, please call me. I want to come find you. With love, always, Daniel." Henry watched her fold the letter as if it were made of glass. She said nothing, just stared out the window with trembling hands, the letter pressed to her chest. "Do you want to use the phone?" he asked gently. She looked at him, tears finally breaking through the dam. "Not yet," she whispered. That night, she sat by the window long after the diner closed. Henry brought her a blanket and turned off the lights, save for the warm glow above her booth. She spoke into the darkness. "I'm afraid he won't recognize me, that I'm too far gone, too broken." Henry crouched beside her and looked into her eyes. "He sent the letter, didn't he? That means he already sees you. Not the worn clothes, not the years, just you." She nodded, but the fear lingered. "Will you be here if he comes?" "I'll be right here," Henry said. "We both will." 3 days later, a man walked into the diner, suitcase in hand, eyes scanning every booth with growing urgency. "Mama," he said, voice cracking like a boy's. She stood slowly, unsure, frightened. And then he ran, arms wrapped around her like the years had never passed, like he was still 5 years old and she was still Mama Bird. Henry stood back, wiping his eyes with a dish towel, pretending the onions needed chopping. Something had changed in that moment, and it wasn't just for her. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something neither of them saw coming. The first time Daniel sat down at Henry's table, he ordered nothing. He just held his mother's hand across the chipped tabletop and stared at her like he was trying to memorize her all over again, the new lines on her face, the gray in her hair, the stories she hadn't yet told. Henry kept the diner quiet that afternoon, turning down the radio and putting a closed sign up early. They sat there for over an hour, barely speaking. Then, finally, Daniel asked, "Where have you been all this time?" Her voice was low. "Hiding. From shame. From the world. From myself. You didn't have to. I thought I did." Daniel exhaled, his eyes welling up. "I never stopped looking for you. I thought you were dead, Mama." "I almost was," she said. They cried together after that. Quietly. The kind of crying that happens when grief and relief collide inside a human heart. Henry watched from behind the counter, pretending to refill the salt shakers. Something about witnessing that reunion made his bones ache, not from sadness, but from some heavy, buried joy. That night, Henry gave them the diner. Not literally, of course, but he locked the doors, turned off the sign, and let them have the space. He cleaned in the back room, humming softly to the sound of their voices weaving themselves back together. He heard Daniel laugh once, and it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard come out of that old place. In the days that followed, something changed in the air. People started showing up at Henry's table with more than just hunger. Some brought flowers. Others brought stories about lost loved ones, missed connections, second chances. The booth by the window became known as Mama Bird's nest. People waited for it, sat in it with reverence, left small notes under the napkin holder, called my dad after 6 years. "Thank you. Your story gave me hope." Forgiveness is real. Henry didn't understand it at first, but word had gotten out. Someone had posted on social media a local college kid who'd come in for coffee, witnessed the reunion, and shared a heartfelt thread on Twitter titled, "The Diner That Heals People." It went viral. In a week, journalists showed up. Henry hated cameras, but they filmed him anyway, the modest man in the stained apron, flipping pancakes and mending hearts one pot of coffee at a time. Mama Bird sat quietly in her booth, Daniel at her side, nodding gently when strangers asked to shake her hand. She said little, but her presence was loud. People needed a miracle, and somehow, Henry's table had become the place where they thought they might find one. But not everyone came with open hearts. On a rainy Thursday evening, just as the dinner rush had calmed and the booths had emptied, a man walked in with sharp eyes and a cruel grin. Henry spotted him instantly. The man scanned the diner like he owned it, then locked eyes on Mama Bird. "Eleanor," he said. Mama Bird froze. Daniel stood slowly. "Who are you?" The man chuckled. "Family." Eleanor. Mama Bird didn't speak. Her face had turned to stone. The man stepped closer. "She didn't tell you about me, did she? I'm her brother. The one who bailed her out back in Albany. The one who paid for her trailer, her hospital bills, the bus ticket she never used. She left us. Left me. Took the money and disappeared." Henry moved out from behind the counter, his fists clenched, voice steady. "This isn't a place for scenes, sir." The man laughed, bitter and sharp. "Oh, I'm not here for a scene. I'm here for the truth." Daniel stood between the man and his mother. "If you cared, where were you when she was sick? When she was on the street?" "I was there," the man spat. "She pushed everyone away, drank herself into oblivion and vanished. And now she gets a redemption arc because she cried over coffee in some dusty diner." "Enough," Eleanor said. Her voice was clear, solid, the quiet thunder of a woman finding her spine again. "You want the truth? I did drink. I did run. But not because I wanted to. Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I was already dead. And yes, you helped me. Once. Then you used it like a leash. I disappeared because I needed to breathe." Silence. The man looked at her with something close to disgust. Then he turned to Henry. "You people don't know her. You don't know anything." Henry took a step forward. "We don't have to. We believe what we've seen. And what we've seen is someone trying." The man scoffed and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the bell fell off its hinge. Eleanor's hands were shaking. Daniel held them until the tremor passed. No one spoke of it again. But that night, after closing, Henry found Eleanor scrubbing the floor near the booths. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I do," she replied, still on her knees. "Not because I owe it. Because I want to give something back." Henry bent down beside her. "Then help me keep this place alive. Not with money. With who you are." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. And nodded. That summer, Henry's table changed forever. It wasn't about the food anymore, though the pot roast remained a bestseller, and the pie could still make grown men weep. It was about the people. Word spread far and wide. Busloads of visitors came from neighboring towns, then other states. Not tourists, but seekers. People chasing a sense of restoration they couldn't find elsewhere. Some just came to sit in silence. Others left journals, letters, photos. One woman flew from Arizona just to ask Eleanor one question. "How did you forgive yourself?" Eleanor never claimed to have the answers. But she listened. She listened better than anyone. Daniel eventually quit his job in the city and moved to town. Helped Henry manage the growing crowd. Fixed the jukebox. Started baking fresh sourdough every morning. And Henry found himself changing too. He started going to bed before midnight. Started writing again in the little brown notebook he hadn't touched in a decade. Sometimes he'd sit in the booth across from Eleanor and just talk about his childhood, his regrets, his loneliness. She understood. They all did. One evening, long after the dinner crowd had gone and the air outside smelled like late summer and hope, Eleanor slipped Henry a small folded note. He opened it slowly, expecting another journal page or maybe a thank you. Instead, it read, "Henry, this place saved me, but it's your heart that gave me back my life. You should know, that same heart is still beating for someone else too. Don't let it grow old alone." She didn't say another word, just walked back to her booth, sat down, and watched the stars rising through the window. Henry read the note 3 more times that night. Then he walked into the storeroom, sat on the cot where she used to sleep, and wept. Not from sadness, from being seen. A few weeks later, Henry made a decision. He printed a new sign and hung it above the kitchen door, in clear view of everyone who entered. It read, "This diner isn't just a place to eat. It's a place to return. To yourself. To your story. To what matters." Beneath it, Eleanor's handwriting had added, "And to remember that even the lost can still be found." People took pictures of the sign, wrote songs about it. A documentary crew filmed an entire episode just on the stories born within those walls. The name Henry's Table became a whisper in recovery circles and community centers across the country. But the heart of it all was still just a man, a woman, and a booth by the window. One night, months after Eleanor's first meal, a stranger walked in with a guitar case and a limp. He looked rough, unshaved, weathered by life. Henry was just wiping down the counter when the man asked softly, "You got room for one more?" "Always," Henry said. The man sat in the booth by the window. Eleanor slid in across from him without a word. And the cycle began again. The man with the guitar case didn't say much that first night. He sat quietly, his eyes scanning the edges of the room like he was measuring whether this place was real, whether the warmth in the walls wasn't just another illusion bound to fade by morning. Eleanor didn't push. She just slid him a plate of warm stew and sat across from him like she'd done it 100 times before. After a few bites, he said, "I heard this place fixes people." Eleanor gave a gentle smile. "We don't fix. We witness." He nodded slowly, as if that answer gave him permission to breathe again. His name was Thomas. He had once been a music teacher, played in jazz clubs down in New Orleans, toured with a blues band for a while. Then the pain started, nerve damage in his left leg. Pills. Prescriptions. The slow descent into something he didn't see coming until it had already wrapped around his life like vines. "My wife left. My son won't talk to me," he said one evening, fiddling with the strap of his guitar case. "I lost the house last winter. Been couch surfing ever since." "You still play?" Henry asked him from behind the counter. "Not in months," Thomas said. "Didn't think there was anyone left who'd want to listen." Henry smiled. "You'd be surprised." That Friday, they moved the chairs to the side and cleared a space near the window. Eleanor set up candles. Daniel printed a sign that read, "Friday Night Healing." And Thomas, with shaking hands, opened his guitar case for the first time in what must have been a year. He played. Oh, how he played. His voice was cracked in places, but honest. His fingers slow, but full of soul. The songs weren't just melodies, they were stories stitched into chords, pain transformed into poetry. Every note said, "I'm still here. I still matter." When he finished the first set, the room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then everyone did. And Thomas cried, the way a man cries when he realizes his life isn't over after all. After that, Friday nights became something sacred. People brought instruments, poems, paintings. They brought pain and turned it into beauty. One teenage girl, Ava, read a spoken-word piece about surviving her mother's addiction. She had never performed before. Her hands trembled the whole time. But when she finished, Eleanor stood and wrapped her in a hug so long and so pure, everyone in the diner wiped their eyes. Henry started baking again. Not just pie, but bread. Real sourdough, crusty and warm. He'd been a baker before the Navy back in the days when his father used to wake him up at 4 a.m. to knead dough before school. The rhythm of it came back to him like muscle memory. He found peace in flour. Daniel created a website. It wasn't fancy, just a single page with these words. "Welcome to Henry's Table, a place for second chances." Underneath, A button. Share your story. Stories poured in. Hundreds. Then thousands. From Texas, from Chicago, from small towns in Idaho. People wrote about lost fathers, broken homes, old regrets, and dreams they thought had died. They didn't ask for advice. They just needed to be heard. Daniel printed the most powerful ones and taped them along the diner's back wall. It became known as the Wall of Return. People started making pilgrimages just to see it. But with the growth came challenges. One morning, Henry arrived to find graffiti sprayed across the side of the diner. Frauds. Bleeding hearts get robbed. Eleanor found him scrubbing it off alone. You don't have to fight every fire by yourself, she said softly. I'm used to it, Henry replied. She took the rag from his hand. Maybe, but you don't have to be. That night, Henry stood before the crowded room, something he had never done before, and said, I never meant for this place to become anything more than a diner. But it has, and I can't do it alone anymore. I don't want to. If we're going to keep this alive, we need each other. The room answered back in a standing ovation. By the next morning, volunteers had scrubbed the outside wall clean. A local artist offered to paint a mural. Henry refused at first. He didn't want fame. But then Eleanor whispered something in his ear. It's not about being known. It's about being remembered by those who needed you. The mural went up in 3 days. It depicted a long wooden table stretched endlessly across a golden horizon. Around it sat people of all kinds, young, old, broken, healing. And in the center, behind the counter, stood a man with kind eyes, pouring coffee with one hand and offering a listening ear with the other. They didn't paint his name, but everyone knew who it was. Autumn came. The leaves outside turned the color of old fire. The air chilled. People kept coming. But something in Henry had started to quiet. He moved slower. He forgot names more often. One evening, he stayed behind after everyone had left, sitting in the booth where Eleanor had once lived. Daniel found him there, staring out at nothing. You okay, old man? Daniel asked, sliding into the booth. Henry smiled weakly. Just tired. You've built something beautiful here. Henry looked around the room. I didn't build it. I just unlocked the door. Daniel said nothing for a while. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a wrapped package. What's this? Henry asked. Open it. Inside was a book. A thick, leather-bound journal. On the cover, gold-embossed letters read, The Table Remembers, Stories from a Diner That Saved Lives. Henry flipped it open. Inside were dozens of entries, stories collected from the wall, printed and preserved. At the very front was a dedication. For Henry Thomas Booth, who fed the hungry, held space for the broken, and showed us all how to love louder. You are not just the owner of a diner. You are the keeper of souls. Henry wept quietly into his hands. Eleanor took over more responsibilities. She trained the new staff, organized grief circles on Wednesdays, started a small fund to help the unhoused find long-term care. People came to her like they once came to priests with secrets and shattered dreams. And she received them all with the same 3 words. You're still here. That became the diner's motto. It was stitched into aprons, carved into the wood above the entrance, printed on coffee mugs shipped to 47 states. You're still here. 3 words. But they saved lives. One icy night in December, the power went out in half the town. A blizzard rolled in fierce and fast. Most restaurants closed. Gas stations shuttered. But Henry's table stayed open. Daniel brought in space heaters. Eleanor made soup from what was left in the fridge. Locals came wrapped in blankets, huddling at booths with steaming mugs and stories to pass the time. That night, Henry didn't serve. He sat in the center booth and watched. Laughed. Listened. Cried. When the power flickered back on just before dawn, the whole room applauded, not for the electricity, but for the fire that had been burning in that room all night without it. Then came the day no one expected. Henry didn't open the diner. Daniel found him in his small apartment upstairs, still in bed, eyes closed, a peaceful look on his face. He had passed in his sleep. No pain. Just gone. The news broke the town in half. For 2 days, the diner stayed closed not because anyone said so, but because no one could quite walk in yet. Then, on the third day, Eleanor opened the doors. She didn't say a word, just walked in, tied on her apron, and started the coffee. People trickled in, slowly, quietly, each one placing a photo, a flower, or a note at the corner booth. By noon, the booth overflowed. They held a memorial that weekend. Not in a church, in the diner. No suits, no eulogies, just stories. People took turns standing in front of the jukebox and saying one thing: what Henry gave them. My sobriety. My voice. My daughter back. My life. By nightfall, they lit candles and passed around Henry's favorite pie. Then Eleanor stepped forward, holding the journal Daniel had given him months earlier. She read a single page Henry had written, dated 2 weeks before his passing. I never wanted to be a hero, just a man with a table big enough for everyone. If anyone remembers me, let it be for that. She closed the book and looked around the room. Well, she said, I think he got his wish. After the memorial, the town didn't return to normal because Henry's table had never been about normal. It was about the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. And now, that mission had only grown louder in Henry's absence. Daniel and Eleanor kept the place going. Together, they transformed the small upstairs room where Henry had lived into a sanctuary, a reading space filled with donated journals, letters, and even a small piano someone had left at the door one night with a note that read, "For whoever needs to find their song again." Ava, the teenage poet, came in twice a week to read to those who didn't want to eat alone. Thomas, the musician, began offering free lessons to anyone willing to trade a story for a chord. And Eleanor, now often called Mama Bird by everyone, not just Henry, started writing a book. She called it The Booth by the Window. It wasn't a memoir. It was a reflection. Each chapter told a story not just of her journey, but of the lives that had passed through Henry's doors. It wasn't published, she wasn't ready for that. But copies were printed and kept at the diner, worn at the edges from being read and reread by people who needed its truth. Sometimes, the people who came weren't just strangers. One rainy afternoon, a woman with tired eyes and a suitcase stepped through the door and froze. Eleanor walked over gently. "Welcome." The woman stared. "You don't remember me, do you?" Eleanor tilted her head. "No, I'm sorry. I was in the shelter with you. 10 years ago. Albany. We both left the same night. I didn't make it. I went back to the streets. But someone told me about this place. Said you were here." They stood in silence, tears rising uninvited. Eleanor reached out. "Then maybe," she whispered, "it's time for both of us to come all the way home." One night, 6 months after Henry's passing, Eleanor sat alone in the darkened booth by the window. The diner had long since closed. Rain tapped softly at the glass. Her tea had gone cold. She opened the journal, Henry's journal, and flipped to the last page. There was a single sentence written in blue ink, barely legible, as if his hand had already started to shake when he wrote it. "The table still has room." She smiled, laid her hand flat on the page, and whispered into the quiet, "Yes, it always will." And so it did. People kept coming, not because they needed food, but because they needed something harder to name: belonging, perhaps, or hope, or the simple miracle of being looked in the eyes and seen. There was a man who drove 14 hours from Kentucky to sit at the table his late wife once visited. A child who placed a crayon drawing under the napkin holder that read, "Thank you for making my mommy happy again." A former prisoner who asked if he could volunteer to mop the floors because "I never had a clean place to believe in before." The stories never stopped, and Henry's table kept setting more chairs. When the 1-year anniversary of Henry's death approached, the town decided to do something no one had expected. They closed Main Street for a day, not for mourning, but for celebration. They called it the Day of Return. The idea was simple: come back, to whatever mattered, to whatever you'd lost. to the truth of who you were before the world got loud. Booths from the diner were moved outside under tents. Free meals were served: meatloaf, pie, chili, all cooked from Henry's original recipes. A long wooden table stretched down the center of the road. And at noon, everyone, hundreds of people, stood behind their chairs, held hands, and took a moment of silence. Then Eleanor stood, cleared her throat, and read aloud from the journal. If you are tired, you can rest here. If you are lonely, you are not alone here. If you are broken, you are safe here. This is just a table. But sometimes, a table is the only thing that keeps us from falling apart. Henry Thomas Booth. People cried. Then they ate. Then they danced. And somehow, in all of it, the music, the laughter, the long embraces, Henry was still there. You could feel him in the breeze, in the clink of coffee cups, in the quiet between stories. That night, as the town slept and the candles flickered out, Eleanor sat once more in the booth by the window. She closed the journal gently, placed it in the center of the table, and left a single folded napkin beside it. Written on it, in her careful, steady handwriting, "If you are reading this, you've come home." Winter came again. This time, it arrived not with silence, but with music. The streets outside Henry's table sparkled under fairy lights strung from lamppost to lamppost. A quiet snow blanketed the rooftops, and the hum of conversation inside the diner never quite ceased. Eleanor, now nearing 70, stood behind the counter most days. She didn't move as fast as she used to. Her knees ached more. Her hands sometimes shook. But her voice, that soft, strong, unwavering voice, had never carried more weight. She greeted each person by name, remembered their stories, asked about their children, their dreams, their scars. On the first snowfall of December, she found something strange waiting for her on the windowsill inside the booth by the window. A box. Small, plain, wrapped in brown paper. No note. No name. Inside was a silver locket. She opened it carefully. On one side, a photo of Henry, taken long before she'd known him, smiling behind the counter, flour dust on his apron, eyes full of unspoken kindness. On the other, a tiny engraving. For words. "You kept the table." She didn't cry. She just placed the locket around her neck, closed the box gently, and whispered into the empty booth, "I always will." The years passed. Faces changed. Some who once clung to the booths like lifelines eventually left, not out of pain, but because they no longer needed the table in the same way. Ava got into college. Thomas recorded his first album, Second Verse. Daniel opened a second diner in a small town in Vermont, built in the same spirit as Henry's, with the same long wooden booths and handwritten stories tucked behind sugar jars. But Henry's table in its original place remained the heartbeat. And Eleanor, she stayed. Until the day she didn't. It was spring when Eleanor passed. A soft, quiet morning. The sun breaking through the clouds in ribbons of gold. She died in the booth by the window, hands folded gently over her chest, the journal resting on the table before her. A waitress found her, a young woman named Carrie, who had been taken in after aging out of foster care. She sat down across from her, took her hand, and didn't move until Daniel arrived. Eleanor's funeral wasn't in a church either. It was in the diner. Hundreds came. Old faces and new. Some who hadn't stepped foot in the town in years. They didn't wear black. They wore yellow. Eleanor's favorite color, the color of light, she used to say. Daniel spoke, voice cracking with every breath. "My mother taught me what love looks like in action," he said. "She taught me that compassion isn't a feeling, it's a choice. A practice. A promise." Then Carrie stood. "I didn't have a mom," she said, her hands shaking, "until I walked into this diner." Silence fell again. Then music. Not hymns. But Thomas, now silver-haired and smiling, played the old guitar Eleanor had once encouraged him to uncase. The same guitar he had once been afraid to touch. He played the song she'd loved most, a lullaby he'd written about second chances. After Eleanor was buried beside Henry in a quiet cemetery just outside of town, Daniel made one final change to the diner. He took the booth by the window and turned it into a permanent memorial, not with marble or statues, but something softer. He placed Eleanor's apron on a hook beside the window. Beneath it, a framed copy of her final journal entry. I once believed I had nothing left to give. But the truth is, healing happens not because we are whole, but because we dare to hold each other when we are not. Thank you for holding me. Thank you for giving me back to myself. I am not afraid anymore. I am home. The table was never used again for dining. It became a sacred space. People left flowers there. Letters, rings, photographs, shoes from loved ones lost, paintings, drawings, names etched on napkins. The staff began to call it the last booth. It wasn't about endings. It was about the moment someone finally felt found. 20 years after Henry served Eleanor her first free bowl of chili, a little boy named Luis wandered into the diner with his mother. He was 6. His shoes had holes. His jacket was thin. He held her hand tightly, eyes wide, nervous. Daniel, now older, graying at the temples, came from the kitchen and crouched beside him. "You hungry?" he asked. Luis nodded. "We've got pancakes. Lots of syrup." Luis smiled faintly. They were seated at a warm booth near the window. Carrie brought over coloring sheets. An old woman named Ruth, now the cook, slipped Luis a chocolate chip cookie before the meal. Before they left, Luis tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Are you the boss here?" Daniel smiled. "Sort of." Luis looked around. "This place feels like magic." Daniel knelt again, eyes soft. "It's not magic," he said. "It's just love, served hot." Luis nodded solemnly, as if that were the most important thing anyone had ever said to him. And maybe it was. The story of Henry's table would go on. Through hurricanes and elections. Through sorrow and joy. Through years when the world seemed louder than kindness, and others when kindness quietly reclaimed its voice. The diner stood as it always had, a refuge, a mirror, a home. And above the door now hung a final sign, carved from wood and gently worn by time. "Come as you are. Leave who you were. Return when you're ready." Inside, coffee steamed. Hands reached. Eyes met. And somewhere always someone returned. On the 10th anniversary of Eleanor's passing, Daniel hosted an event called 10 at the Table. 10 former patrons. 10 stories. 10 ways one act of kindness had spiraled into a lifetime of change. Among the speakers, a retired social worker who had once contemplated suicide until Eleanor looked her in the eye and asked, "What would your story say if you let it keep going?" A pastor who'd stopped believing in grace until Henry, without knowing him, poured him a cup of coffee and listened without judgment. A young woman named June who had been born in a shelter and adopted by a couple who first met at Henry's table after leaving abusive marriages. Each story was different, but everyone traced back to a single bowl of chili and an open booth. Late one night after the event, Daniel walked into the now empty diner, stood in the dark, and listened. He could almost hear them. Not ghosts exactly, more like memory echoes, laughter in the corner booth, whispered prayers near the window, the clatter of forks, the scrape of chair legs, the jukebox humming something timeless. And in that moment, he wasn't sad. He was grateful. His mother had once told him, "If you create a place where people can be their truest selves, you've already changed the world." He believed it now. At the far wall, the wall of return had grown beyond control. Stories no longer fit on paper. People began carving initials into the wood. One wall wasn't enough, the ceiling tiles now bore messages. The counter had been sanded and refinished so many times from names being etched, it shone like glass. Visitors now left tokens. A wedding ring from someone who'd finally let go of an abusive marriage. Dog tags from a veteran who'd found sobriety. A small notebook with a single sentence repeated over 90 pages. "I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still here." Daniel didn't throw anything away. He archived it all. He believed one day someone would need it. And someone always did. The diner began offering quiet hours. No phones, no laptops, no music, just silence and connection, strangers invited to sit together and eat without distraction. At first, people thought it would never work. But it did. A woman named Clara, who had recently lost her sight, said it was the first time she ever felt seen without being looked at. People actually heard me, she said, because they weren't trying to escape the quiet. They were sitting in it with me. By the 30th anniversary of Henry's original act of kindness, Henry's table had inspired a movement, small community-run cafes called branches. Each branch wasn't a franchise. They weren't meant to profit. They were promises. In each one, there was a booth dedicated to the original story, a plaque engraved with the words, "Kindness isn't random. It's planted, served warm, and shared." Daniel visited each one over the course of a year. He left behind a journal in every single location. People filled the pages with their own stories. Some joyful, some heavy, all true. And still, the original diner remained, unchanged in essence. The windows still fogged in winter. The bell above the door was still crooked. The same mug with the crack on the side still sat on the shelf behind the counter. But if you stepped inside, something would happen. Your breath would slow. Your guard would lower. You might cry not because of pain, but because you'd suddenly remember what it felt like to belong. You might even leave a note on the table. Just a few words. Nothing fancy. Maybe, "I came in empty. I left holding hope." Or, "Someone loved me here. For the first time in years." Or, "I'm still here." And in the quiet of that booth by the window, the one no one ever sat in anymore, if you listened closely enough, you might swear you could hear Henry's voice. Not loud, not dramatic, just warm, saying, "Welcome home."